There was a time when you could open almost any suburban kitchen drawer, and the same scene would spill out at you. Stacks of pastel bowls, avocado green lids, harvest gold pitchers, the quiet clatter of plastic that promised order in a chaotic family life. On the countertop, a tower of containers clicked shut with that famous burp, sealing in last night's casserole and tomorrow's leftovers like a tiny, colorful vault. Now, smash cut to a different image. A scrolling feed of headlines. Tupperware warns it may not survive. Iconic brand on the brink. The same name that once meant permanence in the pantry suddenly sounds like a company fighting for its life. Imagine owning every kitchen in America and still staring down bankruptcy. Tupperware was not just a brand, it was a plastic empire. Not only did it dominate food storage, it practically owned the idea of keeping food fresh. The name became the word for the entire category, the way people say Kleenex for tissues or Google for search. A 10-cent plastic bowl, molded from what was once industrial waste, grew into a billion-dollar global machine that reached from American cul-de-sacs to living rooms in Latin America and Asia. But that machine came with a paradox. The very system that made Tupperware unstoppable would, over decades, tighten around its neck. It's an example of what happens when a company's greatest advantage quietly turns into its biggest liability. Let me take you back to the core of that system, the Tupperware Party. In the 1950s, while supermarkets filled with canned goods and frozen dinners, Brownie Wise was turning living rooms into sales theaters. She took Earl Tupper's airtight containers, inspired by paint can lids and patented in 1947, and wrapped them in something far more powerful than plastic: aspiration. Housewives didn't just buy bowls, they bought a vision of flexible money, friendship, and a small taste of power inside a world that often kept them at home. His story is one of quiet experiments in a plastics lab, colliding with the loud laughter of women passing bowls around a coffee table. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, because the same direct-selling model that empowered millions of women also trapped many of them in a precarious, commission-only grind. The parties paid for school clothes and family vacations, but they rarely led to real wealth. And over time, that model would trap the company too, locked into living room sales while the rest of retail moved to Walmart aisles, QVC screens, and finally Amazon search results. As big box stores rose, as cheaper competitors flooded shelves, as debt piled up and the once endless party aged out, Tupperware kept clinging to a distribution system that was slowly dying. This is the story of how a plastic bowl conquered the modern kitchen, and how that victory set the stage for a brutal fall. To understand how it all unraveled, the story has to start with a lonely inventor, a strange new material, and a lid that could burp. Tupperware's collapse looks like a business headline, but underneath the filings and the debt covenants is something much larger. This isn't just a story about plastic bowls losing shelf space. It's about how one company quietly rewired daily life in the modern home, then refused to rewire itself. Because of Tupperware, leftovers stopped being a guilty pile on a plate and became a small act of middle-class security. Cold roast beef, half a casserole, the last ladle of soup. All of it could be sealed, stacked, and saved. Not only did that change how families ate and stretched their money, it changed how they socialized. The kitchen table turned into a showroom. The living room became a sales floor. Friendship, food, and commerce blended into one ritual. There was a time when owning a matching set of pastel Tupperware signaled that a family had arrived. The bowls were modest in price, but they carried the power of a quiet empire. Millions of parties, millions of kitchens, an invisible network of women passing order forms and gossip. At its peak, the brand wasn't just in the cupboard, it was in the calendar, on the coffee table, in the rhythm of suburban life. That's the inspiring half of the picture. Tupperware is a story of post-war ingenuity and female economic empowerment, of a strange new plastic turned into a ticket out of boredom and sometimes out of poverty. Housewives who had never held a formal job suddenly managed territories, tracked sales, trained recruits, and earned real money. The company built careers, friendships, and a sense of status around something as humble as a bowl that could burp. But the same story is, at times, inspiring and at times chilling, because it's an example of what happens when the business model that makes you unstoppable becomes the anchor that drags you under. Tupperware's devotion to the party, to the living room pitch, hardened into dogma. As supermarkets, Walmart aisles, QVC segments, and later Amazon listings reshaped how the world bought containers, Tupperware kept preaching yesterday's gospel in yesterday's language. So let me take you back to the 1940s before the empire, to a world of rationing and war gardens, where every scrap of food mattered and refrigerators were just starting to enter middle-class homes. Food spoiled fast, meat was precious, and storage was a daily anxiety. Glass broke, metal rusted, waxed paper leaked. Into that problem stepped a lonely inventor named Earl Tupper, experimenting with industrial plastic and a lid inspired by a paint can. From there, the arc is brutal and complete. Earl's airtight invention, Brownie Wise's party revolution, the global peak when Tupperware seemed untouchable, the ignored warning signs as rivals filled store shelves, and finally, the slow, ominous slide toward bankruptcy warnings and desperate turnaround plans. In the next part of this story, the camera goes back to Earl's workshop, to that first bowl, and to the moment a burping lid promised a different future and a hidden trap. So let me take you back to a quieter moment, long before the parties, before the pastel bowls, before the burp became a sound of power in the American kitchen. The camera pulls in on a thin, awkward New Englander in the 1930s, sleeves rolled up, glasses slipping down his nose, turning a strange lump of plastic over in his hands like it's a puzzle only he can see. Earl Tupper did not look like the architect of a future billion-dollar empire. He looked like the kid in class who fixed the projector while everyone else laughed. Mechanically minded, restless, he spent his life collecting little frustrations the way other people collected coins. Leaky jars, rusting tins, sticky lids that never quite fit. His story is one of small annoyances, slowly hardening into a single obsession. There had to be a better way to keep order in a chaotic world. There was a time when the American kitchen was a battlefield that food usually lost. Refrigerators were new, loud, and unreliable, more status symbol than science. Leftovers went under wax paper that tore, into metal tins that flavored everything faintly like yesterday's beans, under cloth covers that sagged and let in air. A pot of soup might survive a day. Cut fruit turned brown overnight. Housewives stretched every dollar, yet watched food quietly die in their gleaming modern ice boxes. Into that world walked Earl with a problem no one else thought was worth solving. During World War II, DuPont had a waste product piling up, polyethylene. Greasy, grimy, with a foul chemical smell, it was the kind of material executives pushed off the balance sheet and out of sight. Earl saw something different. He took this industrial trash home, shaved it, heated it, pressed it, pushing it through homemade molds, trying to coax it into a smooth, odorless, almost luxurious surface. Night after night, he experimented, changed the temperature, changed the pressure, changed the timing, again and again. Slowly, the ugly clumps turned into thin, flexible walls. He added color, not dull factory gray, but soft creams, sunny yellows, seafoam greens that looked at home on a kitchen table. He worked until that toxic byproduct became food-safe, airtight, and strangely beautiful. From waste, he carved the raw material for a new kind of wealth. But invention is one thing. Changing human habit is another. Earl tried to sell his early plastic goods the respectable way: department stores, hardware counters, neat little displays. The bowls sat under fluorescent lights next to familiar glass jars and solid tin cans. Shoppers picked them up, frowned at the flexible sides, and put them back. No one understood that the burp of an airtight seal meant food lasting days longer, money staying in the family instead of rotting in the fridge. Because he lacked a way to show, not just tell, his miracle quietly failed. The perfect solution was ready. The real problem was everywhere, yet the bridge between them didn't exist. Not yet. And the person who would build that bridge was about to walk into his life, turning a struggling inventor's quiet frustration into a movement that, at times inspiring and at times chilling, would reach into almost every kitchen on Earth, and then begin to crack. The bridge began with a pop. Late at night, Earl Tupper stood over something no self-respecting inventor was supposed to care about: a dirty metal paint can. There was a time when industrial trash was his laboratory, and as he pried at the lid, he noticed the way it clung, then suddenly released with that tight, pressurized snap. That was the eureka moment. If cold, rigid steel could trap paint fumes, what could a flexible new plastic do for air, moisture, and the life of last night's pot roast? Let me take you back to that workbench. Earl shaved, sanded, and experimented with polyethylene until he could mold a lid that bent without breaking, gripped without screws or clamps, and snapped on with a twist of the wrist. The secret was that little burp of air. Press the center, squeeze the edge, hear the soft exhale as oxygen escaped and the seal locked down. Not only did it feel different, it sounded different, and in a quiet kitchen, that tiny noise announced something radical. Your leftovers now lived in the future. The design mattered because it changed what food meant on Monday morning. Airtight walls kept yesterday's casserole fresh for days instead of hours, cut down on waste, and stretched a family's money in a decade obsessed with thrift. Stackable, flat-top bowls turned chaotic ice boxes into neat pastel grids. Lightweight, nearly unbreakable plastic outperformed glass, surviving drops, toddlers, and overstuffed shelves. Because of one lid, the kitchen stopped being a battlefield of chipped Pyrex and wax paper and became a controlled empire of matching containers. But Earl wasn't just engineering function. He was staging a small science fiction film in every fridge. The soft flex of the lid under your thumbs, the gentle resistance as it snapped into place, the audible burp like a tiny pressure valve, and the smooth matte finish in sherbet pastels all felt strangely futuristic. In an era of chrome cars and atomic headlines, these bowls looked like they'd been smuggled out of a spaceship and dropped straight into the hands of a 1940s housewife who had spent her life wrestling with tinfoil and greasy plates. His story is one of quiet power, because in post-war America, owning Tupperware said something. It said your family ate well enough to have leftovers. It said your kitchen was efficient, modern, under control. Friends opened your fridge and saw order, color, and technology lined up in rows. For a middle-class home clawing its way out of Depression-era poverty, that wasn't just storage. That was status. And yet, here was the paradox. On a fluorescent store shelf, Tupperware looked like just another plastic bowl, a strange lid, a higher price, and no one there to demonstrate the burp, the seal, the promise. Shoppers walked right past the quiet revolution. It's an example of what happens when a product is brilliant, at times inspiring, and at times chilling in its reach. But the story around it is invisible. The person who would finally tell that story wasn't an engineer at all. And she was about to turn the quiet pop of a lid into a nationwide performance. She was about to turn it into a show, but before that could happen, Earl Tupper had to learn a brutal lesson. On a regular store shelf, his miracle bowl was just another anonymous object. There was a time when you could walk through a post-war department store and see it hiding in plain sight, stacked quietly between metal flour tins and cheap glass jars, and never know that the future of food storage was sitting right there. Let me take you back to the late 1940s. In the housewares aisle of a Sears or hardware store, Tupperware appeared as neat towers of pastel plastic bowls and cups. No fanfare, no demonstration, no story. Next to them were familiar enemies: glass Pyrex with its reassuring weight, tin canisters that had been in the family kitchen for decades, bargain bin containers that cost half as much. Not only was Tupperware new, it was more expensive, and to most shoppers it looked suspiciously like a children's toy. Consumers faced an education gap so wide that even the cleverest display card could not bridge it. People did not trust plastic around their food. Plastic was for combs, toys, maybe wartime equipment, not for last night's stew. They had never seen an airtight seal in the home, never heard a lid burp out excess air, never been told that this strange, flexible material could keep leftovers fresh for days. Because they did not understand what the seal did, all they saw was a soft, bendy bowl with a premium price tag and no obvious payoff. On the shelf, the magic disappeared. The burp, the dramatic upside-down shake without a spill, the way a dropped container bounced instead of shattering across the kitchen floor, none of that translated through static packaging and silent shelves. A clerk might walk by once an hour. A cardboard sign might mention airtight in small print. But the Empire Earl dreamed of, the wealth he imagined from every refrigerator in America, depended on someone actually touching the lid, hearing that soft pop, feeling that this was different. That moment never came for most shoppers. Meanwhile, the business reality was tightening. High-quality polyethylene was not cheap. The molds were precise. The designs were intricate. Manufacturing costs stayed stubbornly high while inventory just sat, tying up money, gathering dust. Retailers watched the numbers, compared Tupperware's slow turnover to fast-moving glass and metal, and grew impatient. One by one, department stores trimmed their orders, pushed the line to the back, or dropped it entirely. Because the shelves stayed quiet, the balance sheets began to speak, and what they said was ruthless. By the late 1940s, Earl Tupper was in a strange position. He had a revolutionary product that laboratories praised, that engineers admired, that at times inspiring and at times chilling in its potential, promised to touch every kitchen. Yet the market was quietly rejecting it, not with protests or headlines, but with indifference. His story is one of invention without translation, power without a voice, an empire that existed only in his head. And then, from outside his factories, outside his world of patents and plastics, came a single mother from Florida who looked at those dead shelves and saw something else entirely. There was a time when a divorced woman in small-town Florida was supposed to keep her head down, accept her place, and be grateful for whatever money came through the door. Brownie Wise did not get that memo. In a world built for breadwinner husbands and obedient wives, she was raising a son alone, paying the bills with pure hustle, and turning rejection on the doorstep into fuel. Let me take you back to late 1940s America. The war was over. Men were coming home, and women who had run factories were being gently pushed back into the kitchen. Brownie was one of the women who refused to go quietly. Selling for a direct selling company, she walked block after block, knocked on strangers' doors, and hosted little living room gatherings where the real product wasn't just a cleaner or a polish. It was her, the charisma, the jokes, the way she made a cramped house feel like the center of the universe for an evening. Her story is one of reading people the way other salespeople read order forms. She understood who wanted to be flattered, who wanted to be listened to, who secretly wanted an excuse to gather the neighborhood and feel important for a night. She could take a boring household product and wrap it in games, prizes, and gossip until it felt less like a transaction and more like a party. In a culture starved for adult company between diapers, dishes, and daylight soaps, that was real power. Then came the pattern interrupt in her own life. Through that direct selling company, a strange new line of plastic containers appeared. They looked ordinary, even cheap. But when Brownie twisted the flexible lid, pressed the center, and heard that quiet little burp of trapped air, she understood something the stores had missed. This was not a product you glanced at on a shelf. This was a product you had to touch, bend, seal, and open with your own hands to believe. So she tested a theory. In her modest Florida home, she invited women over, laid out these pastel bowls on the coffee table, and turned food storage into theater. She filled containers with water and shook them upside down. She tossed them on the couch. She ran silly contests, timed how fast guests could burp a seal, handed out tiny prizes, and watched skeptical faces turn into delighted conspirators. Housewives who had walked in, thinking plastic was cheap, walked out begging to host the next party. While Earl Tupper stared at dead inventory and failing retail numbers in New England, Brownie's tiny informal operation in Florida was quietly erupting. Her sales reports climbed, then spiked, then refused to obey the limits that every buyer and distributor had confidently predicted. It's an example of what happens when an invention meets the one person willing to rewrite the rulebook. Very soon, those quiet numbers from Florida would collide with Earl's struggling empire, and the question would no longer be whether Tupperware could sell in stores, but whether it even needed stores at all. There was a time when the most powerful salesroom in America wasn't a department store or a glossy catalog. It was a carpeted suburban living room on a Tuesday night, smelling like coffee, cigarette smoke, and freshly baked pound cake. Let me take you back to 1953. A hostess, usually a young mother in a new subdivision, has spent the afternoon polishing the good plates, arranging folding chairs, and nervously checking the clock. Her life is diapers, dishes, and bills, but tonight the house feels different. Neighbors walk in with casseroles and gossip, kids are shooed upstairs, and someone puts on Perry Como in the background. It looks like an ordinary get-together. It is not. Then the door opens again, and the energy shifts. Brownie Wise herself, if the region is lucky, or one of the dealers she trained. Perfect hair, bright lipstick, a big demonstration case. She laughs easily, remembers everyone's name, and moves through the room like a host on a TV show that doesn't exist yet. This is not a clerk waiting behind a counter. This is theater. The show starts simple. She holds up a Tupperware bowl, explains the wonderful modern plastic, and then, without warning, drops it hard onto the floor. Gasps. Nervous laughter. The bowl doesn't crack. Next, she fills a container with water, snaps on the lid, and turns it upside down over the hostess's new rug. No drip, no stain. The risk is part of the script. Then comes the moment every guest will remember. She presses around the rim, forces out the air, and the lid gives that soft little burp. One by one, everyone gets a piece, and the room practices together, a chorus of plastic sighs. It feels silly and strangely satisfying, like being let in on a secret of modern life. Underneath the fun, the money machine is humming. The hostess earns free gifts based on total sales, so she has every reason to pack the room and keep the mood light. The dealer earns a commission on every order, plus a cut if she can recruit a new seller tonight. Above her, managers and distributors skim their percentages. Saying no when the order forms come out doesn't just feel frugal, it feels rude to the hostess, to the woman demonstrating, to the whole little empire of favors and obligations. For many women, this is the first time anyone has treated them as customers with power and as potential entrepreneurs at the same time. They laugh, trade recipes, talk about husbands and children, and also about goals, a new washing machine, school clothes, a family vacation. In a world where a lot of ambition was quietly suffocated, the party offers a sanctioned way to chase extra wealth without challenging the rules too openly. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it turns friendship into distribution. In a single evening, that living room does what weeks on a store shelf never could. It educates, entertains, creates desire, and often converts nearly every guest into a buyer, and a few into recruits. And once Tupperware proved that a quiet cul-de-sac could outperform the fanciest retail floor, the company did the only logical thing. It doubled down and built its entire future on the party. But when an empire is built on evenings like this, what happens when the parties start to fade? But when an empire is built on evenings like this, what happens when the parties start to fade? To answer that, let me take you back to the moment Earl Tupper realized his quiet little plastic experiment was no longer fully under his control. In the early 1950s, Earl's office looked the way a struggling manufacturer's life feels: anxious, paper-cluttered, every number under a microscope. Sales reports came in from around the country, and most of them told the same depressing story. Department stores were confused, customers walked past the bowls, and returns piled up. Then Earl's team noticed something strange. One tiny region in Florida was moving more Tupperware than entire states combined. Not New York, not California. A patch of swampy suburbia around Orlando. On paper, it looked like a typo. A single distributor, a divorced former secretary named Brownie Wise, was somehow outselling big city chains with gleaming displays and full-page ads. For a man who worshipped precision, Earl assumed there had to be a mistake, maybe a bookkeeping glitch, maybe someone double-counting orders. There was a time when a factory owner trusted the department store buyer, not a woman running meetings in her living room. So he went to Florida to see the fluke for himself. He expected chaos. Instead, he walked into a machine. Brownie's living room was a command center. Calendars on the wall, color-coded index cards, phone lines humming. Her sales force arrived not in suits, but in floral dresses and kitten heels. Women who had spent the day with children and chores, and now talked about money, power, and goals. They knew the product cold. They rehearsed demonstrations. They tracked every guest. It felt less like a tea party and more like a disciplined infantry unit disguised as housewives. Then came Brownie's pitch. She told Earl the retail model was killing his invention. On shelves, Tupperware just sat there, mute, misunderstood. In a living room, the seal could be burped, the freezer tricks could be shown, the dream of a modern, efficient kitchen could be sold. Her proposal was ruthless in its simplicity. Pull Tupperware out of every store in America, give her exclusive rights to the party plan, and let her build a national hierarchy of dealers, managers, and distributors. For a conservative New England inventor, it was madness. In that era, every ambitious brand begged for more department store space, more catalogs, more traditional prestige. Brownie was asking him to vanish from the shelves, to walk away from the very definition of success, and bet everything on conversations between neighbors over coffee and Jell-O salad. And yet, the numbers on our Florida reports were undeniable. Because of that single region's explosive growth, Earl finally said yes. Overnight, Tupperware stopped being a struggling retail product and became the engine of a new kind of social commerce, at times inspiring and at times chilling in how it turned friendship into a sales channel. The parties multiplied, the money surged, and inside the company, the center of gravity quietly shifted from the factory in Massachusetts to the living rooms of Brownie's growing army. It's an example of what happens when an inventor hands his empire to a storyteller. The question was no longer whether the party plan worked. The question was what it would do to everyone who depended on it when the music changed. From that moment, the living room stopped being just a room. It became a branch office, a training center, and a tiny outpost of a growing plastic empire. There was a time when every subdivision, every cul-de-sac, could be mapped not just by school districts, but by who controlled the Tupperware territory on each block. The structure was deceptively simple. At the bottom were the dealers, the women who actually hosted and ran the parties, lugging sample kits and order forms from kitchen to kitchen. Above them sat managers who recruited, coached, and nudged them to book just one more party this month. At the top of the field pyramid were distributors who controlled regions, ran warehouses, and turned entire counties into their personal fiefdoms. Neighborhoods became carved-up zones, and every friendly coffee visit was a potential lead. Every birthday gathering a recurring sales venue waiting to be claimed. The recruitment pitch wrapped that hierarchy in velvet. Brownie Wise and her lieutenants promised flexible hours, extra money without neglecting the home, and a way to help the family without threatening the husband's role. Sell on Tuesdays, still have dinner on the table by 6. It sounded safe, respectable, even virtuous. On top of that came the promise of belonging to something glamorous, a community where a woman from quiet suburban poverty could suddenly find herself on stage in a cocktail dress, celebrated for her sales figures instead of her casserole recipe. Psychology did the heavy lifting. Let me take you back to those legendary Jubilee rallies in Florida. Marching bands, spotlights, theme costumes, and Brownie calling women by name as they walked across the stage. Pins, trophies, engraved bracelets, their photos in company magazines, status markers everywhere, all for moving plastic bowls. Part-time sellers were treated like corporate stars, complete with applause, tears, and those carefully staged before and after stories about the life Tupperware built. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling, because the line between encouragement and control blurred under the confetti. Yet the money was real enough to matter. For many women, Tupperware checks paid for washing machines, kids' school clothes, or the first television in the living room. Sometimes it went toward a down payment on a modest house in a new subdivision, tiny steps away from their parents' rented apartments, in wartime scarcity towards something that looked like middle-class wealth. In an era when a bank wouldn't lend to a married woman without her husband, Tupperware quietly slipped cash into her purse every week. But here's the pattern interrupt. Behind the parades and prizes, the risk flowed downward. Income was unpredictable. Party cancellations, bad weather, or a new baby could wipe out a month. Samples, catalogs, travel to rallies. Those costs often landed on the sellers themselves. Because of that design, empowerment and exploitation coexisted in the same living room, powered by the same pitch. And as the company pushed for ever more parties, ever more recruits, the pressure on that pink-collar army would only grow when the outside world started to change faster than Tupperware did. Empowerment and exploitation were the engine. The numbers were the smoke pouring out of the hood. There was a time when Tupperware was moving so fast that even executives could barely keep up with the charts on the wall. Let me take you back to the late 1940s. On paper, Tupperware was almost nothing. A few plastic containers, a few $1,000s in sales, and a founder who had just pulled his product out of traditional stores because it wasn't moving. Then the parties hit. By the early 1950s, annual revenue leapt from those humble beginnings into the millions. By the mid-1950s, estimates put Tupperware's sales in the tens of millions of dollars a year, an empire of airtight bowls built almost entirely from living room conversations and folding chairs. The geography followed the money. Brownie Wise started in Florida, throwing parties in modest post-war homes where GIs and their young families were just getting used to refrigerators and leftovers. Then came the Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, the land of split-level houses and booming auto plants, where a Tupperware party could turn a quiet cul-de-sac into a buzzing showroom. Within a few years, it was coast to coast. On any given night, thousands of American living rooms became temporary storefronts, with women burping lids, passing bowls, and quietly calculating how this little demonstration might change their household budget. Because the parties were everywhere, the culture started to bend around them. Tupperware began appearing in women's magazines as the smart choice for the modern homemaker, a symbol of order in a chaotic kitchen. Newspapers covered record-breaking rallies and top sellers as if they were local celebrities. The brand name slipped into everyday language. A cabinet full of matching plastic became a shorthand for having life under control, for guarding leftovers, money, and respectability with the same tight seal. And the growth was self-feeding. Every satisfied hostess was not just a customer, but a potential recruit. Every recruit brought an entire social circle. Church groups, PTA meetings, bowling leagues, young mothers desperate for adult conversation. One party produced 3 more, those 3 produced 9, and the network spread like a living organism, pulsing along the highways of post-war suburbia. Because of this design, Tupperware didn't need billboards on the interstate. It had gossip at the beauty salon, demonstrations at the bridge club, and a sales force that lived inside the very families it wanted to reach. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, that success came with a hidden cost. The more money the party system generated, the more emotionally and financially locked in Tupperware became. Executives defended the model, guarded it, and treated any alternative, retail shelves, supermarkets, later television shopping, as a threat to the source of their power. It's an example of what happens when a company's greatest innovation hardens into dogma. Because when the outside world finally changed, Tupperware discovered that the party which had conquered America was also the cage it would struggle to escape. There was a time when the center of the Tupperware empire wasn't a factory or a boardroom. It was a woman in a perfectly pressed dress standing on a living room rug, turning plastic bowls into salvation. Her name was Brownie Wise, and for thousands of women trapped between aprons and expectations, her story is one of escape, money, and power. Let me take you back to the early 1950s. Tupperware parties were exploding across America, and at the center of the blast radius was Brownie, a former secretary and single mother from Detroit who had turned herself into a regional sales phenomenon. She didn't just sell containers. She recruited, trained, and inspired an army of hostesses who treated every party like a small rebellion against domestic boredom. Because of her ruthless focus on recognition, prizes, and emotion, sales in her region didn't just grow, they rocketed. Earl Tupper noticed. Quiet, technical, uncomfortable with crowds, he brought Brownie to company headquarters in Florida and gave her real power. She rose from regional organizer to national sales director and then vice president, effectively becoming the high priestess of the party model he barely understood. While Earl guarded patents and formulas, Brownie orchestrated rallies that looked less like corporate meetings and more like religious revivals. The most famous of these were the Tupperware Jubilees. Each year, thousands of top dealers descended on the Florida campus, a manicured fantasy land carved out of swamp, for a week that felt like a cross between summer camp and a coronation. There were parades with floats themed around bowls and burping lids, marching bands, and banners screaming slogans about belief and success. On stage, Brownie handed out televisions, diamond rings, mink coats, even brand new cars, while women wept, screamed, and promised to sell even more. Because of that spectacle, the outside world came calling. Reporters didn't want to talk to the shy inventor in the background. They wanted the charismatic woman who could turn housewives into a sales force that rivaled any Madison Avenue agency. In 1954, Business Week put Brownie Wise on the cover, profiling her as the genius behind Tupperware's meteoric rise. The article barely mentioned Earl. For a man who had clawed his way out of rural poverty, patented the product, and owned the company, that public narrative stung. He had the legal control, the intellectual property, the wealth. Yet magazines, newsreels, and dealers treated Brownie as the true architect of the empire. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when charisma begins to overshadow ownership. Inside headquarters, the air grew thinner. The more Brownie's star rose, the more Earl worried that he'd created a rival he couldn't manage. Whose company was this really? The reclusive chemist or the woman on the stage? That question wouldn't just bruise egos. It would trigger a power struggle so abrupt and so ruthless that many of the women cheering at those jubilees never saw it coming. That power struggle didn't just play out in boardrooms. It reached right into living rooms, onto lace tablecloths, and into the private lives of the women who made the empire possible. Because while executives argued over control, millions of housewives were being told a very different story about what Tupperware really was. Officially, this was liberation. There was a time when the company's brochures and rally speeches promised independence, extra money for the family, and a glamorous escape from routine domestic life. A woman could stay home with the children, keep dinner on the table, and still run her own business. On paper, it sounded at times inspiring and at times chilling, a perfect fit for 1950s America, where ambition had to wear an apron. But the fine print lived off the clock. Demonstrators spent unpaid hours calling neighbors, prepping living rooms, arranging displays, chasing down late orders, and driving to hostess homes. They bought their own samples, refreshments, and prizes. If a party flopped, the company still looked successful. The only one eating the loss was the woman who just spent her grocery money on finger sandwiches and Jell-O molds. At the Jubilees, none of that existed. There, the camera panned to the success stories. The single mother who bought a new car. The farm wife who never imagined she'd earn more than her husband. Their stories were real, but they were amplified, polished, repeated until they became the narrative. Meanwhile, the quiet failures stayed off stage. The women who never recouped their starter kits, who maxed out store credit, who burned out and slipped away with nothing but leftover bowls. Let me take you back to a typical party. The hostess smiles, the kids are shooed away, the coffee is poured. The dealer performs the famous burp, jokes about leftovers, praises the modern kitchen. Underneath the laughter, something else is happening. Every friendship in that room is being gently tested for its commercial value. Saying no now means saying no not just to plastic, but to a neighbor's dream, to her shot at a little wealth and dignity. That was the real engine, emotional labor, constant cheerfulness, endless hosting, remembering birthdays, writing thank you notes, smoothing over hurt feelings when someone didn't buy. The line between social life and sales pitch blurred until many women weren't sure where one ended and the other began. Yet the model fit the era perfectly. Because of rigid gender norms, Tupperware could present itself as both progressive and safe. It let women earn money, build status, even taste power, but always within the walls of the home, always framed as an extension of housekeeping and hospitality. It's an example of what happens when a company reads the culture so precisely that it can challenge and reinforce it at the same time. So what was Tupperware really doing? Was it freeing women from economic dependence, or cleverly monetizing their unpaid social networks under the banner of empowerment? That question would only get sharper as the company's internal tensions finally exploded. There was a time when opening a middle-class kitchen cabinet felt like opening a tiny plastic empire. Doors swung out and an avalanche threatened, nesting bowls in sherbet colors, matching lids stacked like poker chips, every shelf a quiet monument to one brand's power. Let me take you back to a late 1960s evening. The kids are doing homework at a Formica table. The TV in the next room murmurs about Vietnam and moon landings, and in the kitchen, the future looks much simpler. Peas in a pastel green container, last night's meatloaf sealed tight in harvest gold, orange juice waiting in a frosty Tupperware pitcher. The fridge is a showroom, every shelf lined with that same soft palette. Even the smell of leftovers is under control, because Tupperware didn't stop at bowls. It moved piece by piece into every corner of daily life. There were cake carriers with locking handles marching proudly to church socials, Jell-O molds shaped like flowers and rings, deviled egg trays, picnic sets with matching tumblers, popsicle makers for the kids, measuring cups and spoons that clicked together like tiny engineering projects. Every task that had once been improvised with wax paper, coffee tins, and rubber bands now had a designated, branded solution. The result was more than convenience. It was psychological architecture. In a decade of assassinations, inflation, and social upheaval, a well-organized Tupperware drawer promised that at least one corner of life could be controlled. Lids nested, containers stacked, leftovers labeled. Order was visible every time the drawer slid open. For many families, this wasn't just plastic, it was proof. Proof that there was enough food to save, enough money to make saving it worth the effort, enough stability to plan for tomorrow's lunch. Because of that, Tupperware quietly became a badge. The woman whose cabinets were filled with complete sets, whose kids carried the branded lunchbox and sandwich keeper to school, signaled that her family had arrived in the middle class. Not in flashy wealth, but in that new American ideal of neat abundance. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling, a vision of security expressed through color-coded containers. And it didn't stop at America's borders. Parties spread to Europe, Latin America, and Asia, carried by hostesses who adapted the ritual to local foods and customs while the core script stayed the same. Demonstration, games, orders, commissions. In Brazil, bright bowls held beans and rice. In Japan, tiny boxes organized bento ingredients. In France, the brand slipped into apartments where counter space was scarce, but aspirations were not. By the 1970s, Tupperware no longer just sold containers. It owned the very idea of food storage in the public mind. Rivals existed, but they were plastic tubs, while this was capital T Tupperware. The name became the category, the way Rockefeller once meant money and power. Which is why, from this peak, the later collapse would feel almost unthinkable. When a company seems this embedded in everyday life, how does it finally lose its grip on the kitchen? There was a time when the empire of plastic bowls looked unshakable, but inside Tupperware headquarters, the seal was already starting to fail. On one side was Earl Tupper, the quiet Yankee inventor who owned the patents, the company, and the legal power. On the other was Brownie Wise, the woman whose parties had turned a niche container into a national obsession. At first, they needed each other. Then the question became who really deserved the credit, and who would control the money and the myth. As the rallies grew more extravagant, that question stopped being theoretical. Brownie was flying top sellers to Florida, giving away cars and mink coats, staging pageants where women paraded as Tupperware queens. It worked. Sales exploded. But to Earl, watching from the sidelines, it looked less like prudent business and more like a circus he was paying for. Let me take you back to those mid-1950s jubilees in Orlando. Thousands of women descended on company property for a week of prizes, slogans, and choreographed loyalty. Reporters loved it. Magazines profiled Brownie, not Earl. Cameras focused on the charismatic single mother who had climbed from near poverty to corporate power, not the introverted man in the lab who had actually molded the plastic. To a controlling founder, that imbalance felt at times inspiring and at times chilling. Because of that visibility, the friction sharpened. Earl complained about the cost of rallies, the lavish incentives, the way Brownie talked, as if the sales force alone had built the brand. Brownie pushed back that without those women, his containers would still be gathering dust in hardware stores. Their disagreement wasn't just about budgets, it was about whose story would define the company's life. Behind the scenes, another tension was building, legal and financial risk. The party system ran on trust, handshakes, and informal accounting. Inventory moved from factory to distributors to hostesses in a blur of handwritten ledgers and kitchen table cash. To regulators and auditors, that was a maze waiting to be questioned. If a government agency ever dug in, the combination of lavish rewards, loose books, and quasi-independent saleswomen could look less like innovation and more like a lawsuit. For a cautious owner obsessed with control, that was unacceptable. In 1958, without warning, Earl made his move. Brownie was summoned, fired, and escorted out. No graceful retirement, no farewell tour, no shared press release. One day she was the face of Tupperware. The next day, her name vanished from training manuals, speeches, even company lore, as if the parties had thrown themselves. The cruelty was precise. She held no stock. She had no ongoing stake in the wealth she had helped generate, no royalty on every burping seal in America. The empire rolled on. She went home with a severance check and a silenced legacy. Official histories pivoted overnight. The genius inventor reclaimed center stage. The inconvenient woman was edited to the margins. It's an example of what happens when a male founder decides that a female executive has become too visible, too powerful, too central to the story. Tupperware chose hierarchy over the messy truth of shared creation, protecting ownership even if it meant amputating the person who had animated the brand. And the company did win back control, on paper. But when a business erases its own architect of growth, what unseen cracks does it leave in the foundation that only show up decades later? After Brownie's exile, Tupperware did not implode. It did something quieter and, in some ways, more impressive. It learned to behave like a conventional company. The same empire that had been run on intuition, charisma, and handwritten ledgers was pulled into the fluorescent light of mid-century corporate America. Earl Tupper and the executives who followed him tightened the screws. There were proper financial controls now, not just envelopes of commission money changing hands at rallies. Budgets were tracked, territories were mapped, inventory was forecast instead of guessed. Training moved from improvised pep talks in hotel ballrooms to standardized manuals, scripts, and carefully sequenced onboarding. The parties were still the engine, but the machine around them was cleaner, smoother, easier to audit. Publicity, too, became less dangerous. After watching Brownie become the face of the brand and then the perceived owner of its success, leadership grew cautious. Media appearances were vetted. Incentive trips and prizes were calibrated, not lavish experiments in loyalty. There was a time when a star hostess might be handed a boat, a fur coat, and a trip to Florida in the same year. Now, the rewards were more predictable, more defensible to accountants and lawyers. It was still selling dreams, but with a spending cap. Culturally, that meant a subtle but crucial shift. The rallies did not disappear. They were too effective. Women still packed convention centers, still screamed when new products were unveiled, still wore their best dresses for recognition walks across the stage. But the quasi-cult of Brownie was gone. No more single heroine at the center. The speeches leaned on the Tupperware name, on the logo, on the idea of belonging to a brand family, rather than following a charismatic leader. The company had chosen hierarchy, and now it doubled down on impersonality. On the surface, it worked. Sales kept rising. Tupperware expanded into Europe, Latin America, and Asia, translating the party model into dozens of languages and living rooms. Product lines diversified from simple bowls to freezer containers, microwave-safe designs, and color-coordinated sets that promised order in an increasingly chaotic modern kitchen. To the outside world, the drama in Florida looked like a footnote, not a fracture. The money kept flowing, the parties kept humming, the empire kept growing. Yet something vital had been drained from the system. Brownie's genius was not only motivational, it was diagnostic. She could read a room, sense when a format was dying, improvise a new game, or pitch on the spot. She treated the sales force as collaborators, not just distributors, and that gave her an early warning system on changing tastes and habits. When she left, that living feedback loop thinned out into memos and quarterly reports. So yes, the machine was smoother, it was also more brittle. Without a field-obsessed visionary at the center, experimentation slowed. New tactics had to climb ladders of approval. The company was safer, more controlled, at times inspiring, and at times chilling in its efficiency. But as supermarkets, big box retailers, and eventually online platforms quietly rewired how people shopped, a question hung in the air like a hairline crack in a polished bowl. By purging its boldest salesperson, had Tupperware also blinded itself to the next great shift in consumer life and the slow erosion of its own power? There was a time when every new machine that marched into the kitchen looked like it might kill Tupperware. Instead, each one handed the company a fresh reason to exist. Freezers, microwaves, dishwashers, 3 technological revolutions that rewired daily life, reshaped how families handled food, and for a while made that little burping seal feel almost immortal. Let me take you back to the 1950s and 60s when home freezers exploded across suburbia. Families weren't just buying meat for tonight, they were buying for the month, hoarding leftovers, stretching money, and chasing a new vision of abundance. Frozen casseroles, pre-portioned vegetables, mystery meat wrapped in paper and hope. Thin, brittle containers cracked in the cold, glass shattered, paper tore. Tupperware stepped into that chaos with freezer-safe bowls and boxes, plastics engineered not to turn rock hard or shatter at 20 below, promising that a Sunday roast could survive weeks of icy exile and still come back to the table looking respectable. Then came the microwave, a humming, glowing threat to any plastic that dared get too close. Early microwaves were clunky status symbols, and there was real fear. Would they melt plates, poison food, ruin the family? Tupperware's answer was simple and brilliant. New lines with microwave-vented lids, thicker walls, shapes designed to reheat last night's dinner in minutes. Ads and party demos turned this strange machine into something almost friendly, showing hosts popping lids, hearing that familiar burp, and then sliding the same container from freezer to microwave to table in one smooth motion. Dishwashers added the next test. High heat, harsh detergents, spinning jets that could warp, fade, and chew through cheap plastic. Again, Tupperware adapted. Dishwasher-resistant plastics, sturdier molds, product guides that told consumers exactly which pieces could survive the top rack. The message was subtle but powerful. While other containers were disposable, this was an investment, a quiet ally that would endure cycle after cycle as the kitchen turned more mechanical and more efficient. Marketing campaigns hammered this home. Tupperware parties stopped being just about bowls. They became live technology briefings. Hosts reassured nervous mothers that their growing collection would keep pace with every new appliance, that the empire of matching lids and neatly stacked leftovers would not be made obsolete by some humming box on the counter. It was a story of continuity in a room full of change, at times inspiring and at times chilling in how completely it wrapped domestic life around a brand. Through the 1970s and 1980s, that core promise held: preserve food, organize chaos, protect the family's money from waste. The machines could change, the countertops could modernize, but the logic stayed the same, and Tupperware rode each wave like it had been waiting for it all along. Yet hidden in that success was a dangerous blind spot. Tupperware could pivot for any new gadget inside the kitchen, but outside those walls, another revolution was gathering, not about how people cooked, but how they discovered, compared, and finally bought the very products filling their shelves. There was a time when plastic on a shelf meant something rare, almost futuristic, a promise of order in a chaotic kitchen. But as Tupperware was perfecting the party, another force was quietly rearranging the map of American shopping. Let me take you back to the 1970s, when the weekly grocery run was turning into an expedition. Supermarkets were getting bigger, brighter, more aggressive. Then came the big box revolution: Kmart, Target, and eventually Walmart, building an empire of fluorescent aisles where everything the family needed could be thrown into one cart. Cereal, soap, school supplies, and crucially, entire stretches of shelving suddenly devoted to cheap plastic containers. These weren't glamorous, they didn't need to be. No-name brands in flimsy stacks. Multi-packs wrapped in crinkly plastic, colors that looked one wash away from fading. But they were there, at eye level, every single week. A tired parent could grab a bundle of containers the same way they grabbed paper towels, and the register didn't blink. The price was low, the friction was gone, the habit was born. Soon it wasn't just anonymous tubs. Rubbermaid moved in with industrial confidence, offering rugged bins, modular organizers, and food storage that felt solid enough, if not aspirational. Store brands followed, learning fast, copying shapes, mimicking lids, undercutting prices. Because these companies lived inside the supermarket ecosystem, they could run promotions, end caps, 2-for-1 deals, quietly training millions of shoppers that good enough plastic was everywhere, and it was cheap. This is where the psychological ground really shifted. For a generation raised on Tupperware parties, a container had been a little symbol of post-war wealth, a sign that the family was moving up, that life was getting more organized, more modern. Now, food storage was becoming an afterthought, a last-minute impulse tossed into the cart between dish soap and dog food. The magic moved from the living room demonstration to the yellow clearance sticker. Tupperware watched this from the outside and refused to step through the automatic doors. The company clung to its party model, to the idea that the product was premium, that the lifetime guarantee and the precision engineering justified staying out of retail. Management feared that a supermarket shelf would cheapen the brand, turn a symbol of status into just another commodity. On paper, it sounded principled. In practice, it was a slow surrender of power. Because while competitors were colonizing every aisle, Tupperware's world stayed strangely frozen. His story is one of relentless adaptation inside the home, but a stubborn denial of how the world was buying. It's an example of what happens when a company falls in love with its own mythology. And then came the most dangerous shift of all. Children growing up who didn't see plastic containers as something unveiled at a glamorous party, but as a wobbling pyramid on a discount shelf, where the Tupperware name was missing entirely. The next question was brutal. If a brand disappears from everyday sight, how long before it disappears from memory? There was a time when opening a kitchen drawer felt like opening a family album, layers of history stacked in plastic. Let me take you back to a mid-1990s suburb, early evening, fluorescent light buzzing over a laminate countertop, and listen to what that drawer is saying. At the back, there's a faded avocado green Tupperware bowl from the 1970s, the kind a grandmother burped proudly at a party while neighbors clapped. Next to it, a harvest gold pitcher with a fogged over lid, still working, still sealing, still quietly testifying to a promise of quality. But crammed in front of those icons is a new crowd. Translucent supermarket tubs with red snap-on lids, a cracked Cool Whip container, a margarine tub holding last night's spaghetti, and a flimsy deli box from the corner grocery, logo half scraped off in the dishwasher. The empire of plastic has expanded, but the throne is getting crowded. This is the 1990s kitchen, and it tells a ruthless story about money and habits. By now, big box retailers and supermarket chains have learned a simple truth. If people are already here buying groceries, why not sell them a whole tower of food containers for the price of one Tupperware bowl? Walmart stacks no-name sets in wobbling pyramids. Target and Kmart follow, while Rubbermaid and Glad fight for shelf space. Meanwhile, every takeout order throws in a free container. Every deli salad arrives in another reusable tub. The new mindset is brutal in its logic. Why dress up, drive across town, and spend an evening at a party when the drawer is filling itself for almost nothing? Because of that quiet shift, the social ritual that once felt at times inspiring and at times chilling in its intensity starts to look inefficient. In the 1950s, a Tupperware party was a night out, a rare stage for a housewife to earn her own money and authority. By the 1990s, more women are working full-time, commuting, juggling daycare pickups and microwave dinners. After a 10-hour day, the pitch of "come over Thursday night to watch someone demonstrate a bowl" sounds less like empowerment and more like overtime. Inside Tupperware's own reports, early warning lights begin to blink. Party attendance flattens, then dips. Hosts cancel more often. The average consultant gets older every year, recruiting daughters and nieces who quietly decide that selling at the mall or later at the call center feels less awkward than pressuring friends in a living room. In regions where Walmart and supermarket chains are strongest, sales stop climbing. In some countries, they start to fall. The company still speaks proudly about its legions of saleswomen, but the legions are thinning. Then comes the pattern interrupt inside the boardroom. If every kitchen drawer is now a battlefield, should Tupperware finally march into the aisles of the very stores eroding its power? Or would putting those famous lids on a discount shelf destroy the magic that made them special? It's an example of what happens when the model that built an empire becomes the cage that holds it in place. The next decision would decide whether Tupperware protected its past or sacrificed it to have a future. There was a time when getting into Walmart looked less like a business decision and more like a betrayal. For Tupperware's leaders, the world's biggest retailer wasn't a golden escalator to more money. It was a trapdoor that could drop the whole empire into chaos. Inside headquarters, the argument was relentless and, to them, perfectly clear. If those famous bowls appeared on a Walmart shelf at $7.99, how could anyone justify paying $18 at a party? Cheaper prices would ripple through every living room, every hostess script, every promise of exclusive rewards. The fear wasn't abstract. Angry dealers might quit en masse, lawsuits could follow, and the company's one real army, the sales force, could turn on its own general. To understand why they clung so hard, let me take you back to how Tupperware saw itself. This was never just a plastic company. In their own story, the containers were almost props. The real product was the opportunity, the chance for a woman to earn money, build a mini empire of recruits, and escape a life of quiet financial dependence. Tupperware didn't think like Rubbermaid or Ziploc. It thought like a direct selling religion whose true asset was its network of distributors and dealers spread across suburbs and small towns. On paper, the choice to stay out of big box retail made sense, at least for a while. Parties still produced solid margins. A hostess got prizes, the dealer took a cut, the distributor took a cut, and somehow there was still profit left at the top. Those evenings around the dining table were not just sales events, they were loyalty rituals that kept people emotionally tied to the brand. Put that same bowl under fluorescent lights next to generic containers, and the spell might break instantly. Executives knew that if a rep walked into Walmart and saw her best-selling set on an end cap for less, the reaction would be nuclear. Why hustle through 3 parties a week when the customer could grab it on a grocery run? Protecting that belief system, protecting the illusion that these were premium, almost luxury items, felt safer than chasing anonymous shoppers down a crowded aisle. Meanwhile, competitors made the opposite bet. Rubbermaid leaned into mass retail, stacking bright red lids from floor to eye level. Store brands quietly flooded the shelves, teaching customers that plastic containers were cheap, replaceable, and endlessly abundant. The more aisle space they took, the more special became just another word for overpriced. It's an example of what happens when one company protects its mythology while the market rewrites the script in real time. In the end, Tupperware made a fateful trade-off. It chose to defend its aging sales force rather than pursue the next generation of customers wandering through Walmart, Target, and soon online. That decision delayed a revolt, but it also delayed reality. The bill would finally come due when a new wave of retail arrived that couldn't be kept outside the party door. Because the next disruption wasn't just cheaper shelves, it was television, then the internet, then an entire digital world where no hostess controlled the guest list. There was a time when late-night television didn't just sell entertainment, it sold knives, vacuum cleaners, and an entire dream of a better kitchen, one breathless demo at a time. While most brands saw cheesy sets and overexcited hosts, what they were really looking at was the next great revolution in selling. Let me take you back to the 1980s and 1990s. Cable explodes. QVC and HSN turn shopping into a live show, 24 hours a day. Infomercials stretch across midnight, turning insomniacs into customers with countdown timers, before and after shots, and that relentless line, "But wait, there's more." It wasn't just advertising. It was theater, urgency, and social proof, all broadcast into millions of living rooms at once. If any brand on earth was built for that world, it was Tupperware. The whole product depended on demonstration. The burping seal, the airtight freshness, the microwave miracle that turned leftovers into next-day dinners. For decades, the company had trained an army of hosts to turn a plastic bowl into a story about family, money, and a little slice of middle-class power on the kitchen counter. Now imagine that energy on QVC. A charismatic presenter popping lids, pouring out week-old salad that still looks fresh, stacking color-coded sets into perfect pantry towers, while a phone bank lights up on screen. Viewers calling in with their own party memories, sharing how their mother or grandmother swore by that one orange bowl. It was the Tupperware Party, just upgraded from 12 guests on a couch to 12 million on a cable feed. Other kitchen brands understood this instantly. Ginsu knives carved through cans and then tomatoes in the same shot. Blenders pulverized entire bags of ice, then whole fruits, then golf balls, each step more ridiculous than the last. Storage systems promised to tame chaotic fridges with click-lock lids and rotating carousels. Many of those companies had no legacy sales force, no deep emotional story, yet they built massive businesses simply by showing up on screen and making the demo impossible to look away from. Tupperware hesitated. Executives feared channel conflict, worried that if a viewer could grab a set with a phone call, why would they ever ring the neighborhood hostess again? There was anxiety about ceding control to TV hosts who might rush the story, skip the rituals, cheapen the brand. And under all of it sat a corporate culture still anchored in face-to-face selling, still convinced that the only real persuasion happened across a coffee table. It's an example of what happens when a company mistakes its method for its mission. The mission was social selling. The method was the party. The screen was just a bigger living room, but Tupperware largely stayed off stage, while others rehearsed, performed, and cashed in. The irony is hard to overstate. The brand that pioneered social selling in living rooms sat out the next great wave of social-style selling through a screen, then watched as an even larger revolution arrived, one where the audience didn't just watch the show, they became the show. Because when the audience became the show, the stage moved too. Let me take you back to the late 1990s, when a different kind of party was starting. Dial-up tones, clunky monitors, and a strange little website called Amazon that had somehow gone from selling books to, well, almost everything. Brand websites were popping up, banner ads were loud and ugly, and yet something important was happening. People were quietly getting comfortable typing in a credit card number and waiting for a box to arrive at the door. There was a time when that shift was still fragile, still reversible. Companies were experimenting with online catalogs, early e-commerce carts, crude search bars. The brands that leaned in treated the internet as a new empire to conquer, a place to rewrite the rules of distribution, pricing, and power. Tupperware, by contrast, looked at the glowing screen and saw a threat to the living room. Its entire life had been built on hosts, territories, and upline commissions. Money flowed through hierarchies, not hyperlinks. That clash ran deeper than technology. The culture inside Tupperware prized in-person charisma, party games, and the subtle status dance of who could sell the most in a single night. The metrics were bookings, recruits, and rank, not clicks, carts, and conversion rates. To go fully online would mean letting a stranger in a dorm room buy a container at 2 a.m. with no hostess, no demo, and no chance to recruit her into the family. To many executives, that sounded less like innovation and more like betrayal. So the company dabbled. A tentative website here, an online catalog there. But to actually buy, customers were often pushed to find your local consultant or enter a rep's code. Orders were still being routed through the old arteries of the party network. Inside meeting rooms, debates dragged on about whether a direct website would steal sales from parties, dilute commissions, or anger top sellers. The result was a digital presence that looked modern on the surface, yet functioned like a brochure taped to a screen. Meanwhile, the competition did not hesitate. Generic containers, no-name brands, and cheaper imitators flooded Amazon, eBay, and later every online marketplace. They were ruthlessly optimized for search terms like food storage set, tuned for price filters, boosted by reviews and fast shipping. No emotional pitch, no games, just 20-piece set, under $20, arriving tomorrow. It was an example of what happens when a premium, story-driven brand refuses to tell its story where the new generation is actually listening. By the time Tupperware finally pushed harder into e-commerce, something chilling had happened. The company that once owned the very idea of sealing leftovers barely registered on the first page of search results. The new kitchen aisle was a search bar, and in that aisle, Tupperware was a ghost. There was a time when Tupperware didn't just own the kitchen drawer, it owned an entire way of life. Not through TV ads or end caps at Target, but through an army of women who turned living rooms into showrooms and friendships into money. Let me take you back to that army in the 2000s. The typical Tupperware rep was no longer the young suburban mom just testing the waters of paid work. She was in her 50s, 60s, even 70s. Long tenured, fiercely loyal, often with decades of parties behind her. Her calendar, her friends, even her sense of self had been built around the brand. Tupperware wasn't just a side hustle. It was a social life, a support group, a badge of middle-class wealth earned one bowl at a time. Because of that history, the parties themselves had a ritual quality. The same icebreaker games, the same demonstrations of the burping seal that had wowed post-war families in the 1950s. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Inspiring because these women had carved out power and income in an era that often denied them both. Chilling because the world outside their living rooms had moved on. Younger generations didn't want in. Millennials and then Gen Z had grown up with Walmart, Costco, Amazon, and later with gig apps that let them drive, deliver, or freelance on their own schedules. They were more skeptical of direct selling, more wary of recruiting friends into any empire of plastic, and less interested in themed nights around measuring cups. Why spend 3 hours hosting a party when an extra shift, a rideshare route, or a few clicks online could bring in the same money with less social risk? That created a slow, ruthless math problem. As veteran reps retired, got sick, or simply burned out, their territories went quiet. Replacing them was harder every year. Fewer parties meant fewer product demos, fewer recruits, and fewer chances for that old network magic to work. The flywheel that once spun faster with every new hostess began to unwind in reverse, one canceled party at a time. Inside headquarters, leadership could see the demographic cliff coming, but they were trapped. Any bold push into retail, any aggressive shift to online channels, threatened to undercut the very people still keeping the lights on. Raise online discounts too far and the reps would revolt. Put Tupperware on every shelf and the party pitch, exclusive access, personal service, community would collapse overnight. So the company hesitated, compromised, moved half steps at the edge of real change. It's an example of what happens when the life of a business and the lives of its sales force become inseparable. What do you do when the same people who built your empire, who carried your brand through decades of prosperity and poverty, are also the ones who, unintentionally, make it hardest to finally break from the past? The answer to that question would define Tupperware's last great gamble. That last great gamble did not start in a factory or at a party table covered in pastel bowls. It started on a spreadsheet. There was a time when Tupperware's growth alone could dazzle Wall Street. But as the parties thinned out and the orders slowed, the company turned to a quieter kind of performance: financial engineering. On paper, it looked elegant. Interest rates were low, money was cheap, and investors wanted proof that this once mighty empire still had power. So Tupperware borrowed. It took on debt, not to build a new factory or launch a bold digital platform, but to keep the show going. Management approved aggressive share buybacks, shrinking the number of shares so that earnings per share rose even when total profit did not. Dividends kept flowing, sending a reassuring signal that this was still a dependable, shareholder-friendly machine. Let me take you back to those investor presentations in the 2010s. The slides highlighted rising EPS, healthy dividend yields, and glossy photos of smiling saleswomen from around the world. Underneath, however, the story was shifting. In core markets like the United States and Western Europe, sales were flat or quietly slipping. Cheaper containers filled supermarket aisles, Amazon listings multiplied, and younger families no longer needed a neighbor's living room to discover a plastic bowl. Because of that pressure, the logic of the board became brutally simple. If organic growth would not impress, financial tricks would. Debt-funded buybacks. Buybacks boosted the stock. The stock justified leadership's pay packages and kept analysts calm. For a while, it worked. Headlines talked about disciplined capital allocation and returning cash to shareholders, as if this were the reward for a thriving business rather than a mask for its exhaustion. It's an example of what happens when the numbers on the screen start to matter more than the life of the company underneath. But every borrowed dollar carried a hidden cost. As obligations mounted, Tupperware had less room to move. Investing heavily in e-commerce, building direct relationships with big box retailers, or reinventing the brand for a world of Instagram kitchens and same-day delivery would have required real risk. Instead, the balance sheet became a set of handcuffs. Servicing the debt, defending the dividend, and keeping buybacks going left less and less money for the kind of reinvention that might actually have saved the empire. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this phase of the story shows how a company can look healthier as it grows weaker. The parties were shrinking, but the per-share metrics were record. The sales force was aging, but the dividend checks still arrived on time. Quietly, the balance sheet was loading a spring, compressing more tension into every quarter. All it needed was a shock. When that shock finally came, the release would be violent, public, and far too late to hide behind clever accounting. And that's when the world outside Tupperware's living room suddenly turned hostile. The world outside those living rooms was no longer knocking politely at the door. It was in your pocket, glowing at you at 11 p.m., asking a simple question. Need food containers? Now picture the modern consumer. Phone in hand, half watching a show, half cleaning the kitchen. They open Amazon, type food storage set, tap a couple of filters, and within seconds they're staring at 100 options. Full sets. Glass, plastic, silicone, BPA-free, microwave safe, leak-proof. all ranked by thousands of reviews and sorted by lowest price and fastest shipping. 2 clicks and an entire kitchen's worth of containers is on the way before the leftovers have even cooled. There was a time when that impulse would have led to calling a neighbor, booking a Tupperware party, waiting a week, then sitting through demonstrations and small talk. Now the entire ritual has been compressed into a thumbprint and a tracking number. No hostess, no games, no gentle social pressure to buy one more bowl for the good of the group. Just an anonymous transaction and an email receipt. Behind that simplicity, the algorithms were ruthless. Search systems on Amazon and other platforms rewarded 3 things: low prices, fast shipping, and high volume. Sellers that could crank out containers by the container load, shave margins to the bone, and plug straight into fulfillment centers floated to the top. Tupperware, with premium pricing, a legacy commission structure, and a supply chain built around parties and distributors, was playing a 1950s game on a 2020s scoreboard. Because the company had refused for decades to fully embrace retail shelves and early e-commerce when its brand still carried real power, it arrived late to a battlefield already dominated by no-name manufacturers, private labels, and big-box darlings. The old weapons, charisma, community, the promise of a little extra household money meant very little to a search bar that ranked by Prime and 4.6 stars. It's an example of what happens when a once dominant empire mistakes nostalgia for a moat. Meanwhile, the brand itself was dissolving in plain sight. Younger shoppers casually used Tupperware as a generic word for any container, then filled their carts with cheaper lookalikes from supermarket aisles, IKEA bins, or whatever popped up first online. The name survived in language while the company lost the sale. At times inspiring and at times chilling, that is the dream of every marketer and the nightmare of every balance sheet. Then came the pattern interrupt no focus group could fix. When a cracked lid needed replacing, people didn't ask, "Who's my local consultant?" They asked their phone. The answer, again and again, was whoever shipped fastest for under $20. Let me take you back to those aging sales reps, still hosting parties for shrinking circles of friends, as their customers quietly ordered competitors in between refills of coffee. The party model hadn't just stalled, it had been outflanked. And the next blow wouldn't come from a rival hostess down the street, but from the very retailers Tupperware had spent decades keeping at arm's length. There was a time when a living room full of laughing guests meant money, power, and security for the Tupperware empire. Then, almost overnight, that same living room became a potential crime scene, a place where a simple gathering could threaten someone's life. Let me take you back to early 2020. News of a strange virus turned into footage of overflowing hospitals, then into government orders. Stay home, avoid visitors, no unnecessary gatherings. The same cozy spaces that had hosted millions of Tupperware parties for decades were suddenly off limits. Hostesses, who once bragged about packing 20 people into a small apartment, were now counting 6 feet between chairs and wondering when it would be safe to invite anyone over again. For Tupperware's aging sales force, this wasn't an abstract public health headline. It was the moment the lights went out on their only real stage. Calendars packed with spring parties were wiped clean in a week. Long-planned hostess events, incentive trips, regional rallies, canceled. Reps who lived on the rhythm of invitations, demonstrations, and order forms watched their schedules, and then their income, disappear. The impact was immediate and brutal. No parties meant no product demos, no impulse buys, no social pressure to help out your friend by ordering one more container. The carefully tuned machine of home selling, the compliments, the games, the raffles, the guilt, went silent. Orders from the field dropped sharply. Some reps tried porch drop-offs and driveway pickups, but without a crowd in the room, the whole psychology of the sale collapsed. Ironically, Outside those empty living rooms, demand for what Tupperware sold was exploding. Lockdowns forced families to cook at home, fill freezers, and hoard leftovers. Pantries were suddenly strategic assets. Retailers sold out of plastic containers and glass storage. Search traffic for food storage surged. It was an example of what happens when the market finally lines up with a company's product, but not with its business model. If Tupperware had been sitting on a strong e-commerce site, prime retail shelf space, and slick digital marketing, this could have been a windfall. Instead, people typed food containers into Amazon and grabbed whatever arrived fastest. The brand that once defined the category watched a once-in-a-generation spike in demand flow to cheaper rivals and supermarket labels. Inside headquarters, the scramble began. Virtual parties on Zoom, online catalogs, hastily assembled social media scripts for reps who had spent their careers mastering living room banter, not ring lights and hashtags. Some consultants did manage to pull friends onto Facebook Live, waving spatulas at webcams and trying to recreate that feeling of being in on something together. But a mute button doesn't pass a bowl around the room. Screens flatten the subtle pressure of watching everyone else buy. The intimacy, the gossip, the little status dance around who orders the biggest set. All of that was hard to digitize at speed. The pivot felt rushed, improvised, and for many, humiliating. The pandemic didn't just expose that Tupperware was behind on e-commerce. It revealed a deeper structural truth. This was a company whose entire life depended on one fragile behavior: people willingly gathering in living rooms. When that single point of failure snapped, so did the illusion that tradition alone could keep the empire standing. And the shock of 2020 would force Tupperware to confront an even harsher reality about its debts, its aging sales army, and the shrinking value of its once mythic brand. There was a time when Tupperware felt as permanent as the refrigerator door it clung to. The name was so woven into daily life that it stopped being a product and became a category. Which is why the next chapter in this story hits with a different kind of force. The moment the company itself admitted in writing that it might not live much longer. In corporate language, that confession has a very specific name: a going concern warning. Hidden in the dense pages of an annual report or a quarterly filing, it's a line that says the auditors have substantial doubt about whether the business can meet its bills or even continue operating over the next 12 months. Not a rumor, not a blogger's hot take, but the company and its accountants looking at the numbers and saying, out loud, this empire might not survive. Let me take you back to the early 2020s. Sales had been sliding for years. The party model was fading, and Tupperware was carrying heavy debt, taken on during more optimistic times. Interest costs were rising, refinancing windows were closing, and the hoped-for surge from new channels never quite materialized. When management ran the scenarios, lower sales, higher rates, aging sales reps dropping out, the math stopped working. The result was stark. Formal warnings that Tupperware might not be able to refinance, might not be able to raise new money, might not make it as a going concern. Because of those filings, the reaction was instant and brutal. Headlines blared that Tupperware could be on the brink, that the end of an era might be coming for the brand that once ruled kitchen cabinets. The stock, already wounded, plunged further as traders treated the warning like a fire alarm, not a drill. Yet alongside the panic, something else surfaced, a wave of nostalgic commentary from people remembering their mother's orange pitchers, their grandmother's freezer containers, the first time they learned to burp a lid. Behind the filings, the operational reality was even harsher. the markets that once seemed endless were shrinking or flooded with cheap alternatives. The sales force that had powered the company's rise was aging, thinning out, and far less able to recruit a new generation raised on Amazon reviews instead of living room pitches. And the cost structure, the factories, the overhead, the global bureaucracy had been built for a much larger, healthier company than the one that now existed. It's an example of what happens when a business designed for permanent growth runs into permanent change. The brand still carried emotional weight, but emotional weight does not pay interest on bonds. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the public filings read like a confession that the life Tupperware had known was ending. Yet the most unsettling part was psychological. A company that had once felt indestructible was openly saying it might not survive the next few years. And as those words sank in, executives were forced into a final, ruthless question. What exactly could be sold, sacrificed, or reinvented to keep the name alive at all? So Tupperware did the unthinkable. After 70 years of guarding the party like a sacred ritual, it walked into the fluorescent glare of big box retail. Target announced a partnership. Tupperware displays appeared between Rubbermaid and generic knockoffs, and a brand that once refused to sit on a shelf was suddenly begging for end cap space. There was a time when that move would have rewritten the rules of the entire category. Instead, it felt late, very late. By the time Tupperware finally embraced retail, plastic containers were already a commodity, stacked high in supermarkets, dollar stores, Amazon listings, and every warehouse club in sight. Competitors had normalized the idea that food storage lived on shelves, not in living rooms. What might have been a bold land grab in the 1990s now looked like a retreat into enemy territory, with lower margins, brutal price comparisons, and no guarantee that a nostalgic logo could command a premium. To make the leap feel less desperate, executives tried to dress it up. Limited edition color drops, sleeker, more minimal lines, collections designed to look good on Instagram countertops rather than in a 1970s pantry, influencer-friendly bundles with pastel lids, and photo-ready fridge sets. On paper, this was the modern refresh critics had begged for. Make the brand aspirational again, speak to younger families, trade the church basement demo for the social media scroll. But underneath the new palettes and collabs, the math was merciless. The company was staring down hundreds of millions in debt, shrinking sales, and a direct selling base that was aging out. A few Target aisles and seasonal design capsules were tiny in comparison, more like experiments than lifelines. Each dial generated headlines and a brief spike of curiosity, yet the revenue barely moved the needle on an empire that had once flooded entire countries with parties. Worse, the very moves meant to save the brand threatened to erode what was left of its old power. Because if you can grab a container on your weekly Target run, why schedule a party at all? Many consultants saw those retail displays not as opportunity, but as betrayal. The same women who had defended the party model for decades were now being asked to compete against their own company in the same aisles their customers already shopped. Here's the pattern interrupt. None of these ideas were inherently bad. In another decade, with a stronger balance sheet and more time, Tupperware's retail push, design collabs, and influencer strategy might have looked visionary. It's an example of what happens when a company waits so long to change that even the right moves arrive as damage control. The brand was finally doing what outsiders had urged for years, but at a moment when its financial runway was measured not in decades, or even in business cycles, but in quarters. And looming over every new launch was a darker question. Even if the product sold, Would it be fast enough to outrun the clock that was already ticking inside its own filings? And while that clock was ticking in the filings, something stranger was happening in ordinary life. The brand was fading from balance sheets, yet its name was still echoing around the kitchen. Not only had Tupperware lost control of its distribution, it had lost control of its own identity. Because there was a time when saying, "Pass me the Tupperware," meant a very specific bowl with a very specific burp. Today, it just means any plastic container with a lid. College students who have never seen a Tupperware party, never met a dealer, never opened a catalog, still talk about Tupperware in the fridge the way people say Google for search or Uber for a ride. The word survived, even as the empire behind it was quietly shrinking. Let me take you back to a sitcom living room in the late 90s. A character opens a chaotic cabinet, an avalanche of mismatched lids crashes down, and someone mutters a line about too much Tupperware. The joke lands because everyone recognizes the reference, not because everyone owns the product. The same thing happens in nostalgic magazine pieces showing pastel 1950s kitchens, or in retro TikTok aesthetics, where a rainbow of vintage Tupperware sits on Formica countertops as shorthand for post-war prosperity, family order, and a very specific dream of middle-class wealth. Pop culture kept replaying that dream. Articles about your mom's Tupperware cabinet treated it like a shared childhood memory, even for readers whose families mostly bought discount containers at Walmart. Interior designers staged mid-century shoots with classic Tupperware on open shelving. It became a prop, a symbol, a time machine. The irony was that at the exact moment the image felt timeless, the company itself was running out of time. This is the paradox of success turning into genericide. When a brand name becomes the category, you win the language but lose the edge. It's an example of what happens when a company gains mindshare yet cedes the shelf. Because if every plastic box is Tupperware, then the real Tupperware has to fight on price, on visibility, on promotions against cheaper rivals sitting directly in front of shoppers at Target and on Amazon. In real kitchens, this looked almost comical. People would proudly say, "Don't throw away my Tupperware." Then the camera, if it existed, would zoom in to reveal a cloudy, unbranded tub from a supermarket multi-pack, or a rival logo quietly stamped on the bottom. The loyalty was to the idea, not the invoice. That was the ghost story. Tupperware lived on in language, in jokes, in memory, but not in the moment when a card actually tapped a terminal. The name was everywhere and nowhere at once, drifting through conversations while competitors captured the money. And as the company's sales force aged and its debt mounted, this gap between cultural presence and commercial absence became deadly. Because what happens when your brand is immortal, but your business model is not? The answer would show up in the next phase, when even the ghosts had trouble paying the bills. Those ghosts didn't just haunt the balance sheet. They started showing up on YouTube exposés and Reddit threads. Because while Tupperware was drifting, another story was taking shape online. The story of multi-level marketing, at times inspiring and at times chilling, turning from be your own boss into beware the pitch. Let me take you back to the 2010s. Documentaries dug into companies promising financial freedom and delivering maxed-out credit cards. Lawsuits accused big-name direct sellers of operating like pyramid schemes. Facebook groups and subreddits filled with people comparing notes on ruined friendships, garage loads of unsold inventory, and upline leaders preaching mindset while downlines sank into debt. One company after another was dragged into the spotlight, and the verdict from the internet jury was ruthless. Tupperware was not Herbalife. It wasn't pushing miracle shakes or mystery supplements. It had a real product with real value, born from Earl Tupper's airtight seal and decades of engineering. Those bowls survived microwaves, freezers, dishwashers. They were the opposite of junk. But the way money moved around the empire, the way recruitment sat alongside sales, the way success stories were paraded to lure new hosts and new reps, shared DNA with the more exploitative MLMs. And online, nuance tends to get flattened. There was a time when a party invitation meant coffee, cake, and a neighbor showing off space-age plastic. By the 2010s, younger consumers saw the same invitation and quietly wondered what the catch was. Was this about friendship or money? Would girls' night end with a hard close on a starter kit? The living room, once a symbol of post-war community, now looked suspiciously like a pop-up sales floor. To a generation raised on side hustle burnout stories and viral MLM horror threads, any party-based pitch felt like a threat to both social life and financial stability. That shift hit recruitment like a brick. For decades, Tupperware could tell a clean story. Flexible hours, extra cash, maybe a path to real wealth if you climb the ranks. Now, every claim about empowerment had to fight against a wall of screenshots, memes, and long-form explainers about how most MLM reps lose money. The same compensation structure that once looked clever now looked like a risky game with limited upside, where the house usually won and the players quietly disappeared. And here's the irony. The model once celebrated for giving women a way into the economy, for paying them for the social labor they already performed, was now framed as exploiting that same unpaid emotional work. Hosting, nurturing, maintaining the neighborhood web of relationships became the raw material the company monetized. It's an example of what happens when a business leans too hard on community. Eventually, people ask, who is really getting paid? Yet the real damage wasn't just reputational. The backlash would start to twist the company's own internal logic, forcing moves that push Tupperware even closer to the edge. Because once the world starts calling you a pyramid, what do you do next? So let me take you back to a Tupperware party. Not the smoky mid-century living room you might be picturing, but a modest suburban townhouse in 2023, where a folding table has been pushed against the wall and half the chairs are empty. The consultant, in her late 50s, smooths a branded tablecloth and lines up containers with that familiar burping seal. 3 guests sit on the couch, another hovers in the kitchen doorway, and someone's toddler is watching cartoons in the next room. Between demonstrations, thumbs flick across phone screens. Notifications light up faces that, in the 1950s, would have been locked on the hostess, laughing at every joke, hanging on every promise of a neater fridge and a more glamorous life. There was a time when this scene felt electric. Post-war housewives, isolated in new suburbs, treated a Tupperware party like a rare festival. Gossip, games, prizes, a reason to dress up. The empire was built on that emotional scarcity. Tonight, though, every guest already has a group chat, a Netflix queue, a dozen other ways to escape the boredom of domestic work. This is one social event among hundreds, not the highlight of the month. The consultant holds up a $35 bowl and talks about engineering, about plastic blends that won't warp, about lifetime guarantees. Her story is one of loyalty. She's had the same set for 30 years, through kids, moves, even divorce. But across from her, a 20-something quietly checks an Amazon cart where a whole stack of containers costs $99.99, with free next-day delivery and no awkward party games attached. Because the world shifted, the pitch has become a struggle. The script still leans on demonstrations of freshness, on the satisfying burp of the lid, on the idea that paying more now protects your family's food and saves money over time. Yet the audience lives in a culture of disposability where stained containers get tossed without a second thought and returns are a two-tap process. Lifetime guarantees sound noble, but also a bit like a promise from a different century. Then the generational gap widens. The consultant reads from cue cards she's memorized over decades, talking about ladies hosting get-togethers, offering a magnet if someone books a party. The younger guests trade glances. They live in a digital marketplace of flash sales, influencers, and one-click checkouts. Their loyalty is to convenience, not to a living room ritual. Pattern interrupt. The most engaged person in the room is the oldest. She nods along, finishes sentences, remembers when her mother did this. For her, the party is a time machine. For everyone else, it's content. A few Instagram stories, a nostalgic anecdote, then back to real life. And that's the core problem. The ritual that once made Tupperware unstoppable still has power, but mostly as nostalgia. It's an example of what happens when a business model turns into a museum exhibit while the market races ahead. The party survived microwaves and freezers. The question now is whether it can survive a world that no longer needs the party at all. There was a time when that question had an obvious answer. Of course the party would survive. Of course the brand that owned every kitchen table would find a way to own the supermarket aisle, the TV screen, and the phone in your pocket. But that never really happened. Let me take you back to the first big fork in the road. As American families poured into supermarkets in the 1950s and 60s, entire empires were being built on shelf space alone. Tupperware had the product, the prestige, and the momentum. A counterfactual version of this story has Tupperware striking exclusive deals with grocery chains, turning that burping seal into the Coca-Cola of food storage, while still keeping parties as the glamorous premium channel. Instead, supermarkets filled with cheaper containers, and the empire stayed behind closed living room doors. Then came big box retail. Walmart, Target, and later Costco did to household goods what Rockefeller did to oil. They consolidated, undercut, and flooded the market. Imagine Tupperware in the 1980s launching a sub-brand just for those stores. A simpler line with lower margins but massive reach, while the classic catalog and party line remained the aspirational choice. The shelves would have trained a new generation to see plastic containers as Tupperware by default, even as the sales force kept its higher-end, color-coordinated sets. TV shopping was another missed wave. QVC and HSN were built for demonstrations, for that satisfying lid, burp, for before and after fridge makeovers. A hybrid model could have put top consultants on television, turning them into minor celebrities, driving both call-in orders and local party bookings. Instead, those slots went to rivals who were happy to play the game. By the late 90s and early 2000s, early e-commerce opened yet another door. A more aggressive digital pivot might have meant influencer-led virtual parties on early live stream platforms, monthly subscription boxes of containers sized for seasonal produce, even early experiments with smart kitchen integrations, lids that tracked leftovers, apps that helped plan meals around what was already in the fridge. His story is one of relentless expansion. Tupperware's is one of cautious defense. On paper, none of this was impossible. A party-based premium line, a mass-market sub-brand in retail, a direct-to-consumer website feeding leads back to local consultants, influencer partnerships that paid the field instead of bypassing it. But every path ran through the same minefield: fear of alienating the sales force, legacy systems built for paper orders and living room demos, leaders whose careers and identities were tied to the old model's glory days. Because of those constraints, decisions that once looked prudent, protect the party, avoid channel conflict, don't upset the field, slowly became fatal. It's an example of what happens when loyalty to the past outweighs bets on the future. Salvation was never guaranteed, competition was ruthless, consumer habits were shifting, and debt was piling up. Yet this downfall was not pure fate. It was a long series of understandable choices that, taken together, closed nearly every escape hatch. And as the market kept evolving without them, the bill for those choices finally came due. Those escape hatches didn't just close by accident, they were sealed shut by a mindset that had once won the war. There was a time when Tupperware's leaders really were generals, and the battlefield was mid-century America. The enemy wasn't Amazon or TikTok. It was retail indifference, dusty store shelves, and buyers who didn't believe plastic could be elegant. So, they built a weapon. The Tupperware Party was not a cute marketing idea, it was artillery. Brownie-wise turned living rooms into sales trenches, where demonstrations, games, and social pressure broke through skepticism that no department store display could touch. In that world, direct selling wasn't just efficient, it felt heroic. Housewives earned money, built community, and turned a 10-cent bowl into a symbol of middle-class wealth and control over the home. Victory came fast. Sales exploded from almost nothing to tens of millions. Tupperware was in every kitchen, across the country, then across the world. And because those wins came from one model, leadership drew a simple conclusion. The party plan wasn't a channel, it was the company's soul. His story is one of a product, a method, and a mission being fused together so tightly that to question the method felt like attacking the mission itself. It's an example of what happens when early success hardens into dogma. Kodak told itself it was a film company, not a memory company, even as it literally invented digital photography. Blockbuster believed it was in the late FE and physical rental business, not the movie access business, even as streaming walked right through the front door. Tupperware, in the same way, defined its empire around the living room, around the ritual of women gathering to burp lids and win prizes long after the living room stopped being the center of consumer life. Inside the company, the language reflected that. Executives didn't just talk about strategy, they talked about the Tupperware way, as if it were a moral code handed down from Earl Tupper and Brownie Wise. Training materials celebrated the party as empowerment, as family, as almost a social movement. Selling through supermarkets, partnering with Walmart, or going all in on e-commerce didn't feel like smart experiments. It felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, the real war was changing. Supermarkets were teaching people to grab containers along with milk. Big box stores were turning kitchenware into a low-margin impulse buy. Later, Amazon would make every no-name container only one click away. But Tupperware kept aiming its artillery at the wrong target. The real enemy wasn't Walmart or Amazon. It was nostalgia for an era when neighbors had time for parties and a plastic bowl could carry social power. Let me take you back to the moment that nostalgia finally met reality, when the outside world forced Tupperware to choose between its cherished past and a very uncomfortable future. Nostalgia met reality in living rooms first. There was a time when Saturday nights meant folding chairs in the den, Jell-O salads on the coffee table, and one woman at the center of it all, the Tupperware lady. For Linda, that wasn't a nickname. That was her life. For 30 years, she booked parties, memorized catalogs, and watched her calendar fill so fast she color-coded it just to keep up. Then, slowly, the colors faded. Text messages replaced invitations, guests stopped RSVPing, and the phone that once rang off the hook went quiet. Her bookings dropped from 3 parties a week to one a month if she pushed. The money followed. What had once helped pay the mortgage, fund vacations, and send kids to college turned into gas money and a polite hobby. But the real loss wasn't just income, it was identity. When neighbors stopped introducing her as our Tupperware lady and started saying she used to do those parties, it landed like a verdict on an entire era. Far from the living rooms, another world was unraveling. In plants that had once run 24 hours a day molding those famous burping lids, workers started seeing machines sit idle. Orders shrank, shifts were cut, and rumors traveled faster than the conveyor belts. One month, it was a temporary slowdown. The next, it was consolidation. And then, finally, entire factories went dark as production moved or was outsourced in the hunt for cheaper labor and thinner costs. For the people on those lines, Tupperware wasn't an abstract brand. It was the empire that had sponsored the Little League team, paid for health insurance, and turned high school graduates into skilled technicians. Layoffs didn't just erase jobs, they hollowed out towns where every paycheck bounced between the diner, the car dealership, and the grocery store. Because when a plant closes, the parking lot empties, but the mortgages don't. Inside corporate offices, the decline looked different, but felt just as ruthless. Staff sat through PowerPoints promising reinvention, new logos, new channels, new digital-first strategies. Each pivot came with reorgs, new bosses, and whispered questions in the elevator about whether the latest turnaround plan would actually turn anything around. It's an example of what happens when a once invincible company lives for years under a cloud of going concern warnings and quiet headhunter calls. Pattern interrupt for a second. While spreadsheets were bleeding red, garages and attics were overflowing with indestructible color. The children and grandchildren of those early reps inherited boxes of legacy Tupperware and stories of past glory. Grandma, who won a sales trip to Florida, Mom, who paid off credit cards with party bonuses. But when those same kids looked for their own opportunity, they found a website no one visited and a party model their friends ghosted. At times inspiring and at times chilling, Tupperware's story shows how decisions made decades earlier ripple into the present, reshaping families, careers, and entire communities long after the commercials stop airing. And as the human cost piled up, one question remained. What happens when the brand that organized so many kitchens can no longer put its own house in order? There was a time when the most powerful thing about Tupperware wasn't the plastic at all. It was the party. A 10-cent bowl with a burping seal was clever. An army of hosts turning living rooms into sales floors was revolutionary. That was the real breakthrough. The engine that took Earl Tupper's quiet invention and blasted it into an empire of kitchens, paychecks, and neighborhood gossip. Let me take you back to the early 1950s. The product sat ignored on store shelves, confusing shoppers who didn't know why they should burp a lid. Then Brownie Wise walked in with one ruthless insight: don't sell the bowl, sell the gathering. She wrapped the container in games, prizes, and a promise of money and status for women who had been told their place was only in the home. Overnight, the party wasn't just a sales tactic, it became a life script. Because the party model worked so well, it rewired everything inside the company. Compensation plans, promotions, recognition, all of it revolved around one behavior: host more parties. Careers were built on recruiting, not retail. Identity hardened around the idea of being a Tupperware lady, the queen of the neighborhood, the one who could turn coffee and cake into rent money. When a system hands out wealth, applause, and a new sense of self, questioning it feels dangerous. So when supermarkets exploded, when Walmart rose, when QVC started beaming products into millions of homes, Tupperware looked at those channels and hesitated. Selling through Target might boost volume, but it would undercut the woman who depended on 2 parties a week. Launching big on TV could move units, but it would cheapen the exclusivity that made hosts feel special. E-commerce threatened to do something even worse, make the party optional. Over time, the very model that once unlocked new markets became a set of invisible walls. Competitors like Rubbermaid and Ziploc raced onto store shelves and then onto Amazon, while Tupperware tiptoed half in and half out, terrified of betraying its own sales force. It's an example of what happens when the thing that gave a company power also becomes the thing it cannot bear to abandon, even as the world moves on. His story is one of oil and railroads. Tupperware's is one of plastic and parties. But the pattern is the same. Many companies are not defeated by rivals. They are trapped by their own greatest ideas, by systems that once rescued them from poverty and finally delivered wealth, then quietly turned into anchors. So here's the uncomfortable question. In your own work, what is your Tupperware party? The beloved method, the trusted routine, the channel that once saved you, that might now be quietly holding you back. There was a time when the most powerful sales force in America wasn't on an app, it was in your neighbor's living room. Today, the living room is a Lyft, an Uber, a TikTok feed, a Twitch stream. The stage changed. The story did not. Let me take you back to that Tupperware rep, hauling samples in the family car, opening her home, pouring coffee, trading gossip and money in the same breath. Now zoom forward to an Uber driver using a personal vehicle, a DoorDash courier burning their own gas, an influencer turning a bedroom into a permanent studio. In each case, labor and personal assets are on the line, while a distant platform controls branding, pricing, and data with near imperial power. The Tupperware Party was a semi-private theater. Friends, neighbors, maybe a cousin, all gently steered toward a purchase. Today, that theater looks like an influencer drop on Instagram, a YouTube live shopping stream, a Discord server where links and discount codes circulate like invitations to a secret sale. The walls are digital now, but the logic is identical. Social relationships are the channel. Trust is the currency. Plastic bowls, skincare sets, limited edition hoodies, it barely matters. Because of that, the language wrapped around these systems feels eerily familiar. Tupperware promised women flexibility, independence, a way out of quiet poverty without leaving the home. Gig platforms promise the same. Be your own boss, set your own hours, unlock earnings potential. Creator programs dangle wealth, fame, and freedom. Yet, just as with the Tupperware empire, the risk quietly flows downward. Reps held unsold inventory. Drivers eat the downtime between rides. Small creators chase ever-changing algorithms while the platforms keep the data, the margins, and the power. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this is how modern empires recruit. The pitch is empowerment. The structure is dependence. And when the market turns, the platform pivots. The worker does not. Here's the crucial difference. Digital platforms can scale and mutate faster than Tupperware ever dreamed. One tweak to an app, one new recommendation engine, one viral trend, and an entire business model can be rerouted overnight. But that speed is a double-edged blade. Because of their ruthless focus on growth, they are just as exposed to shifts in culture, regulation, and sentiment. One law about contractor status, one viral boycott, one privacy scandal, and the whole promise of frictionless wealth can evaporate. So Tupperware's life is not just a nostalgic curiosity, it's an example of what happens when a core model falls out of sync with the culture that once embraced it. Studying its rise and collapse is like getting a time-lapse preview of what may happen to today's celebrated gig and creator platforms when the party mood breaks, when the hosts burn out, when the guests stop buying. The only question now is who will recognize the pattern in time, and who is already trapped in the next Tupperware party without realizing it. There was a time when opening a kitchen cabinet in America felt almost predictable. A soft thud of plastic, a flash of pastel, and somewhere a lid that somehow still fit after 20 years. For all the jokes about plastic bowls, Tupperware earned that place. It did it the hard way, with design that quietly worked, day after day, while everything else in the house broke. Let me take you back to Earl Tupper staring at a paint can lid. That simple, airtight seal became the famous burp closure in 1947, a tiny ritual where the container literally exhaled as the air escaped. It was clever theater and serious engineering. The walls were just flexible enough to snap, the lids interchangeable, the shapes stackable. Drawers stayed organized. Freezers stopped smelling like mystery soup, and leftovers survived the week. One container might hold flour this year, Lego bricks 10 years later, and a garage full of nails 20 years after that. Because the design was modular and standardized, a family could build a whole little empire of order out of it. Tall canisters lined up like soldiers, shallow dishes nested into each other, everything color-coded. In an era of wobbly tinfoil and glass that shattered, this felt like power. A cheap, durable kind of power that didn't announce itself, but quietly made daily life less chaotic. But the real innovation wasn't just on the shelf, it was in the living room. Brownie Wise's Tupperware Party model turned sales into a social ritual, where neighbors gathered, laughed, traded recipes, and watched demonstrations of burping bowls and unspillable Jell-O molds. Many of those women weren't just selling containers, they were building community. Friendships formed around carpooling to rallies, sharing childcare, and comparing sales goals at the kitchen table late at night. For some, this was the first money they controlled without asking a husband, the first public role beyond the home, the first time anyone called them manager. His story is one of ruthless oil barons. Theirs was one of gentle, plastic-fueled ambition. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the same model that trapped many in unpaid emotional labor also gave others the confidence to leave bad marriages, pay for college, or finally buy a car. Here's the twist. In a world now drowning in a flimsy, disposable plastic, the idea of a container used for 30 years looks almost radical. Tupperware's durability, once mocked as boring, suddenly reads like accidental sustainability. Grandmothers passed down battered measuring cups that outlived multiple microwaves. The product aged better than the business. So the problem was never that Tupperware created something trivial. The failure came in how that value was delivered and discovered. The parties stayed while shopping moved to Walmart, QVC, Amazon. The containers remained excellent while the channels around them decayed. It's an example of what happens when a company builds real value, then freezes the script. Even an empire of plastic can leave behind a strange legacy, cabinets full of survivors, and memories of nights when the kitchen felt like a small, hopeful stage. The question is what happens when that durability collides with a brand that can't keep up. There was a time when a Tupperware logo in the cupboard meant you'd made it. a tiny badge of middle-class stability lined up in pastel rows. Now that same logo was showing up in a very different place, on filings that quietly asked whether the company could even survive the year. By the early 2020s, all the pressures that had been building for decades finally met in the same cramped balance sheet. Sales were falling as younger families bought cheap containers from Target, IKEA, or Amazon without a second thought. The legendary sales force that once packed living rooms had shrunk, and in many regions simply vanished. Tupperware had missed supermarkets, missed Walmart, missed QVC, then watched the e-commerce wave crash over it from the shore. On top of that came heavy debt from years of financial engineering, and then the pandemic, which shut down in-person parties almost overnight. The entire life of the brand had been built around gathering people in kitchens. Suddenly, kitchens were off limits. So the empire of plastic did what empires do when the borders start collapsing. It cut. Factories closed, offices were consolidated. Thousands of people who had spent their working life selling the dream of leftovers that never spoiled were laid off. Management sold assets, from regional units to real estate, trading long-term presence for short-term cash. Credit lines were renegotiated, covenants adjusted, deadlines pushed back, all to keep the lights on one more quarter. Press releases spoke of exploring strategic alternatives, a phrase that usually means everything from a fire sale takeover to a carve-up in bankruptcy court. Every so often, there would be a flicker of hope, a licensing deal here, a social media campaign there, a sudden spike in the stock price after rumors of a rescue. Commentators would ask if this was the comeback, if the brand that outlived microwaves and freezers could outlive Amazon too. But the chart kept sloping the same way, revenue down, margins squeezed, interest payments eating what little profit remained. Because of those relentless trends and the sheer weight of its obligations, some form of restructuring or bankruptcy stopped being a distant fear and started looking like the only realistic plan. And that carried a strange symbolic weight. This was the company that once promised domestic security in physical form, airtight lids, organized shelves, food and money saved for tomorrow. Now it was facing the most public kind of instability, where judges, creditors, and lawyers would decide what survived. The brand that had helped millions of families feel safe was now fighting for its own survival in the one arena no business wants to enter. Let me take you back to the choice that made this feel inevitable. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was the visible end of a slide that began when Tupperware chose to protect its parties over its future. It's an example of what happens when a company confuses the method with the mission, clings to the gathering instead of the customer, and discovers too late that nostalgia doesn't pay the interest bill. The courtroom was only the last container. The leak had started decades earlier. There was a time when a plastic bowl was more than a bowl. It was a ticket into a new kind of life, a small piece of technology that promised freshness, order, even a hint of middle-class power sitting right there on the kitchen counter. Tupperware's legacy lives on that edge. On one side, it is a story of inventive genius and female economic participation. Earl Tupper staring at paint, can lids until the airtight seal clicks in his mind, and Brownie Wise turning post-war living rooms into sales floors, where women, locked out of traditional careers, finally made real money. On the other side, it is a warning about how systems engineered perfectly for one era can fail ruthlessly in the next, not because they stop working, but because the world quietly rewrites the rules around them. Ambition is the hinge. Earl and Brownie's drive created something genuinely new. He reimagined plastic from cheap wartime surplus into a symbol of domestic wealth. She reimagined the housewife from unpaid labor into the beating heart of a sales empire. Their ambition was pointed forward, aimed at invention, experimentation, risk. But as decades passed, that same word meant something else inside the company. Ambition became the pressure to hit quarterly numbers, to manage debt, to polish financial optics, while avoiding the harder, messier ambition of tearing up the playbook and starting again. Because of that shift, nostalgia stepped in as both shield and trap. Customers clung to the memory of parties, catalogs, and the soft pop of that famous burp. Grandmothers passed down sets like family heirlooms. That emotional glue kept the brand alive long after supermarkets, Walmart, QVC, and eventually Amazon had trained everyone to buy containers off a shelf or a screen. Yet inside headquarters, the same nostalgia lulled leaders into believing there was always one more party, one more incentive trip, one more heroic saleswoman who would save the month. Here's the core caution. When a company defines itself by how it sells instead of why it exists, it starts mistaking the channel for the mission. Tupperware did not exist to host parties. It existed to solve food storage. But the party became sacred. The method turned into identity. And once that happens, it becomes very hard to admit that the method is dying, because to do so feels like erasing the company's soul. Let me take you back to the present for a moment. Look around, at legacy retailers clinging to malls, at media companies guarding cable bundles, at universities defending 100-year-old calendars and buildings, while online alternatives quietly scale. It's an example of what happens when institutions fall in love with their delivery system instead of their purpose. Viewers can map Tupperware's arc onto those empires, spotting where ambition has narrowed, where nostalgia is being weaponized, where the mission has been quietly replaced by the mechanism. Because the real question is not whether a plastic bowl can go bankrupt. The question is which beloved institution today is already walking the same path and doesn't know yet that its own party is almost over. So bring that question right into your kitchen, into your career, into the quiet routines that feel safe. Because there was a time when Tupperware's party model wasn't a relic, it was a weapon. It conquered living rooms, rewired social life, and pulled serious money out of a 10-cent plastic bowl. The danger wasn't that it failed. The danger was that it worked too well, and then never really changed. Every viewer has their own version of that party. A sales script that used to close every deal. A job title that once felt like a promotion and now feels like a cage. An identity as the operations person or the creative one that made sense when the empire was smaller, but now quietly limits power and pay. Because of past success, the habit feels sacred, untouchable, almost moral. Questioning it feels like betrayal. So pause the story for a second and run a quiet audit. What is your living room party? Are you clinging to one distribution channel because it's familiar, even as the world moves to platforms you secretly mock? Still betting everything on in-person networking while your competitors build audiences on TikTok and LinkedIn? Still loyal to a dying role in a shrinking department, hoping that tenure will outrun reality? Here is a simple way out. Separate mission from method. Tupperware's mission was never host parties. The real value was helping families protect food, save money, and feel a small sense of wealth and order in the kitchen. The party was just the delivery system. So ask, with ruthless honesty, what value are you actually creating? Stability? Insight? Beauty? Speed? Who is helped, and how would they describe that help in one sentence? Once that mission is clear, method becomes negotiable. If the value is teaching, maybe the classroom is obsolete, and the real arena is YouTube, cohort courses, or internal company academies. If the value is connecting buyers and sellers, perhaps the cocktail hour needs to become a marketplace, a newsletter, a niche online community. The mission stays. The container changes. Let me take you back to the waves Tupperware watched roll by. Supermarkets, Walmart, QVC, e-commerce, each one an invitation, each one a threat. So translate that into your field. What are the Amazon moments around you right now? AI tools quietly automating the easy part of your job. Direct-to-consumer brands bypassing old distributors. Remote-first companies hiring globally while local offices argue about parking spaces. Which wave are you treating as a fad because admitting it's real would force a reinvention? His story is one of clinging and breaking, at times inspiring and at times chilling, but here is the twist. Adaptability is not a betrayal of past success. It is the only way to honor it. Holding the mission and releasing the method is how an idea survives when its favorite format finally dies. And if that sounds dramatic for a plastic bowl, it's an example of what happens when any of us confuse the container with the thing it was meant to protect. Because under all the nostalgia and corporate drama, this is not just the life story of a plastic bowl. It is the arc of an entire era, compressed into one airtight seal. There was a time when that little burp meant progress, prosperity, and a very specific vision of home. Let me take you back to that lonely engineer in a New England workshop, shaving industrial waste into something smooth, clear, almost elegant. Earl Tupper was not chasing viral trends or influencer deals. He was chasing a better lid, a seal that kept air out, flavor in, and money from leaking away in spoiled leftovers. His story is one of quiet obsession, of turning war-era polyethylene scrap into an object that would outlast the meals it guarded. Then the camera swings to a different stage. Brownie Wise in a living room, not a lab. No lab coat, just a polished smile and a table full of bowls. She turned housewives into a sales force, neighbors into an audience, and the Tupperware Party into a weekly ritual. Demonstrations, games, prizes, whispered promises of a little extra cash, a little extra power, inside a world that told these women they belonged only in the kitchen. At its peak, millions of these gatherings lit up the suburbs, like a social network powered by coffee and Jell-O molds. From there, the empire swelled, Tupperware in cupboards, on wedding registries, in lunchboxes at school and on factory floors. Ubiquitous, dependable, almost invisible. That was the strange wealth of the brand. When something is in every kitchen, it stops feeling like a product and starts feeling like infrastructure, until, slowly, the ground moves. Supermarkets roll out their own containers. Walmart stacks entire aisles with cheaper options. QVC beams rival brands into living rooms that once hosted parties. Amazon turns storage into a search term. Culture shifts, women's work shifts, attention shifts. And a company that once rewired human behavior in the home now struggles to keep up with human behavior on a phone screen. It's an example of what happens when technology, culture, and habit all change direction while a dominant player keeps marching straight. There is something at times inspiring and at times chilling about that. A better lid, a clever party, a new way to gather a family, then a neighborhood, then a nation. Small innovations that quietly rearrange daily life, and then, just as quietly, lost their grip. For many viewers, watching Tupperware fade is not abstract. It is opening a cabinet at a parent's house, seeing stained orange bowls, and realizing the company that defined those memories is flirting with bankruptcy. That's the bittersweet part. The product still works, the world around it doesn't, and that is where this story turns. Because this is not only about Tupperware losing relevance, it is about how each person watching relates to change, to nostalgia, to the tools trusted every day. The next question is not what happened to Tupperware. It is what happens when the containers in a life start to crack. So pause for a second and do something strange for a business story. Open the cupboard, the real one. The one in the kitchen where the daily life of a family actually lives. Plates stacked, lids wandering, bowls without their partners like soldiers lost from the regiment. Look closely. Is there a faded orange or avocado green bowl with a warped lid? A cloudy container with a little raised logo that once meant quality, modernity, even a hint of wealth? Or is it all generic tubs from the supermarket, glass jars from IKEA, a random empire of mismatched plastic that arrived one 2-click order at a time? Because those shelves are a quiet archive. There was a time when a full set of Tupperware on that shelf signaled that a household had made it into the post-war middle class. A time when a burping seal was cutting-edge technology, when Earl Tupper's paint can-inspired lids felt almost futuristic. Now the same shelf might be ruled by discount brands, supermarket giveaways, and whatever arrived in a cardboard box yesterday afternoon. Think about how each object got there. One bowl might have come home in the 1950s after a Tupperware party, where a young mother watched Brownie Wise's sales army turn living rooms into showrooms and felt, for one night, like the center of a tiny empire. Another might be from a fluorescent Walmart aisle in the 1990s, tossed into a cart between cereal and laundry detergent. The newest might have been summoned with a thumb on a phone, paid for with digital money, delivered by a stranger who never knew a party model even existed. Each path into the cupboard marks an era of distribution. Home parties, big box retail, e-commerce, each wave rewarding a different kind of innovation, punishing a different kind of inertia. Tupperware rode the first wave brilliantly, then watched the next ones break over its head. That is the heart of this story. Innovation versus inertia, empowerment versus exploitation, the danger of confusing a successful method with an eternal truth. The party was at times inspiring and at times chilling. It gave women money, community, and a role outside the narrow script of 1950s domestic life, while quietly extracting value from unpaid hosting, emotional labor, and social pressure. It's an example of what happens when a company mistakes one brilliant distribution trick for a law of nature. So here is an invitation. In the comments, name the oldest piece of Tupperware in the kitchen. Describe the color, the scratches, the party where it appeared, or the relative who swore it would last forever. Turn that comment section into a living archive, a map of how one company's choices rippled through millions of ordinary kitchens and lives. Because that isn't just nostalgia, that is data, real-time evidence of how power moves, how products colonize a cupboard, how an empire rises, stalls, then clings to its last square inches of shelf space. And once those stories are laid out side by side, the next question becomes unavoidable. What current forever brands are already fading quietly to the back of the shelf? What current forever brands are already fading quietly to the back of the shelf? Before that drawer closes and the camera cuts away from those scratched, mismatched lids, there is one more move in this story. Because there was a time when Tupperware felt permanent, inevitable, as fixed in the American kitchen as the refrigerator humming in the corner. Now it sits in bankruptcy court. That gap between of course and gone is where this channel lives. So if this kind of deep dive into an everyday empire speaks to you, if treating a plastic bowl like a full-scale epic with heroes, villains, money, and power feels like the right way to read business history, hit subscribe. Around here, a food container is never just a food container. It is a map of labor, gender, aspiration, and fear, at times inspiring and at times chilling in what it reveals. Because this is not just Tupperware's life, it is a pattern. Earl Tupper in his workshop, Brownie Wise in a living room full of neighbors, a global army of hosts trading time and dignity for commissions that rose and fell with the business cycle. His story is one of invention. Hers is one of charisma. Together, they built an empire from 10-cent plastic, then watched as supermarkets, Walmart, QVC, and finally e-commerce walked right past the party and straight into the cart. Now, here is the question that hangs over all of it. Was this downfall baked in from the beginning, or did a handful of missed decisions seal its fate? Was clinging to the party model when Amazon was rewriting retail just stubbornness, or a tragic loyalty to the very engine that made them rich? Drop your answer in the comments. Point to the moment you think the ground really started to give way. And while you are there, name the next quiet empire that deserves this treatment. The razor brand in your shower, the detergent under your sink, the frozen dinner that shows up in 100 million freezers but never in headlines. Let me take you back to those products, pull them apart, and show how much power is hiding in plain sight. Share this video with someone who grew up with Tupperware stacked in their cabinets, who remembers burping the lid and packing leftovers like it was a small family ritual. Use it to start a conversation between generations about how work moved from the factory to the party to the app, and how the home turned into a sales floor, then into a shipping address. Because if a company that once owned every kitchen can end up begging lenders for time in bankruptcy court, it is an example of what happens when the ground under all of us moves faster than we expect. The only real question now is what we choose to do about it, before the next forever brand quietly disappears from the shelf.